The Russians see this through the lens of ideology, the Ukrainians self-preservation, and Western Europeans and Americans see politics. But those who are familiar with Ukraine, they see this through the lens of a spiritual hegemony, and that's what Russia is trying to do. They're utilizing the church as a means to control domestic population and as a means to influence international populations.
Do you think Tucker Carlson went a little too light on Vladimir Putin? Vladimir Putin seems to think so. He was disappointed by the lack of piercing questions from Tucker Carlson. I mean, I don't know. He didn't let him get a word in edgewise for the first hour and a half. But nonetheless, we're going to have a conversation later this hour with Father Jason Charron. He is a Ukrainian priest, and he is going to be on to talk about the fallout from a Ukrainian Catholic perspective of the Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin conversation that happened, what was that, a week ago or so? That's going to be a great conversation coming up this hour.
By the way, my name is Joe McLean. I host a radio program called A Catholic Take, where we look at the world through a Catholic lens. I'd love for you to hang out with us. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
Hey, I saw some great conversation with Father Jason Charron on his YouTube channel after the Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin interview that I found fascinating. I was able to reach out to him, and by the grace of God, he's joining us now. Father Jason Charron, good morning to you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Joe, for having me.
What is your opinion of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia in general? And then specifically, what was your take of the Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin interview?
Well, first of all, I like to point out a call to perfection fallacy that, name one government that is, free of corruption. Name one government that is pristine. If we were to use that, line of reasoning, we never would have sent, any aid to the Soviet Union during the Second World War when they were invaded by the Nazis. Yet what we sent to the Soviet Union with Lend-Lease was far in excess to that which we are sending to Ukraine now. Our support to them is a matter not of their moral purity, but it is a reflection on we as a nation that honor our word, because we signed the Budapest Memorandum and we enticed them to give up their ballistic missiles, their nuclear warheads, in exchange for a seat at the table of democracies in 1994, with the promise that we would defend them if they were under attack. Well, they're under attack, and now we're finding all kinds of justifications to weasel out of our agreement. And if we do that, we are at great risk of losing any negotiating power that we as a nation have with nations down the road. So that's one thing I like to point out. Secondly, is the Ukrainians don't want American tax dollars. This is something that is being used by both parties in Washington, D.C. to kick the can down the road. Ukrainians, I've been there 3 times since the invasion, and their consistent response is simply use Russian funds that are sitting in American banks to help us defend the common good and our self-defense. So here in the United States, we have, I think it's about $300 billion of Russian assets that we're not touching. Yet they're quibbling over American tax dollars. Don't give them American tax dollars. Give them Russian funds to defend themselves. That's a matter of justice. The argument's been turned on to a domestic level, and it's not about that. It's about simply a matter of justice. And if Russia is sending missiles into kindergarten buildings and schools and hospitals, then I think it's perfectly justifiable within Catholic social teaching to simply use confiscated Russian assets to help the victims of Russian aggression. As for your question there, that's a good one about how am I viewing this present conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Great question. I'm viewing it through kind of a pneumatic lens, a spiritual lens, not through a political lens. This conflict is really seen. The Russians saw this back in 2018, 2019, because of the Greek Orthodox. Has nothing to do with us. Has everything to do with the Patriarch of Constantinople issuing a decree of self-rule or autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And that's one of the things that really precipitated this. I mean, one could go back to 2014, obviously, that's where the war really started. But in terms of ratcheting up the conflict ideologically, it was when the Patriarch of Constantinople confounded Moscow and comforted Kiev by saying, you are a self-governing church. And at that point, Russia went into overdrive. And people don't know this. People ignore this or they're ignorant of it. The Russians see this through the lens of ideology. The Ukrainians see this through the lens of self-preservation because their existence is at risk. And Western Europeans and Americans see this through the lens of politics. But those who are familiar with Ukraine, who've been involved in Ukraine for, like I have 25 years, they see this through the lens of a spiritual hegemony. And that's what Russia is trying to do. They're trying to extend hegemony over their former vassal territories militarily, but also spiritually, in utilizing the church as a means to control domestic population and as a means to influence international populations. It was Patriarch Bartholomew who really began to peel this back and say, these Orthodox Christians in Ukraine, they're a self-governing church. And at that point, Russia went into overdrive.
Going to the Tucker Carlson conversation, Vladimir Putin, he's been around a long time. KGB, he's not new, he's not dumb, he's not ignorant, he's not naive. The guy knows what he's doing. He's a master manipulator. Yeah. I saw Tucker being prudential. I imagined that Tucker sat there and took it on the chin, because if he'd tried harder, Putin probably would have gotten up and walked away. And he tried to keep him on the hook and did so for 2 hours. Like, just from an optics perspective of this, how did you take it from a Ukrainian Catholic perspective?
Tucker Carlson is no dummy. And it was disappointing to see someone with such a platform and with such intelligence to allow himself become like a schoolboy in the presence of a teacher, and to allow himself to be thrown around like a Rottweiler throws around a rabbit. He didn't really push back a little bit on the journalist from the Wall Street Journal, a little bit there, a little bit on why are you concerned about Hitler. So those are 2 points where he pushed back. But outside of that, it was very disappointing to see him giving prominent platform from which the nefarious demonic principle of half-truths was spewed. And that's really what we saw there, is that there was a lot of truth co-mixed with half-truths and some blatant lies. And so that was very disappointing, because let's face it, most of us here in North America, we really don't know anything about, Slavic history, about, the history of Ukraine and Russia. And so he can get up there and he can say what he wants. And 99% of people aren't going to be able to push back because we're simply ignorant of it. Ask us about, Declaration of Independence. And even then now again, after the state of our, civics classes here, but, ask us about the Declaration of Independence, and people can, begin to speak a little bit about that, but about the history of Ukraine and Russia and its spiritual patrimony. A lot of what he said there was simply not true. For example, he spoke about the Union of Brest, which will happen in 1596. He made allusion to it at the 6-minute mark as a means of Polish control over what Putin calls the Russian population of Ukraine. That was the exact opposite, actually. The truth is the exact opposite, because it was that Union of Brest which enabled the preservation of these Slavic peoples, these Rus people, as they were called, to have their own liturgical, spiritual, cultural identity. And that church, which is now the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, was the guarantor, the vehicle that delivered that. And where it existed, it preserved that identity. And I can give historical examples of how the Russians would call on priests from those areas of Eastern Poland, Western Ukraine, to come over into parts of Russia in order to teach their people the Byzantine liturgy and how to properly pray the Byzantine liturgy.
I want to get into some of those historical errors. That's what I found really fascinating about your commentary on the Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin conversation. It seemed to me that Vladimir Putin was trying to do a little bit of a shell game here. And maybe you can help us sort of, to untie that knot a bit for us. In the history of the Kievan Rus, where was the original seat of power?
It was in 988 in Kiev. when they were baptized under Vladimir. In the interview, Mr. Putin begins to speak about Novgorod and Rurik, which is not part of the common history. So it's really in the year 988. Even it goes before then, in the late 800s with Helen Olga, and she went to Constantinople.
So was Vladimir Putin trying to paint this picture, this historical lesson that he was giving Tucker Carlson, in a way that made it feel or seem like Russia has a historical right to take back all of these territories? Or is this just more propaganda?
I mean, there's some truth and history there in that the two cultures share a common patrimony, and he's not wrong on that. The propaganda comes in when he speaks about the borders of 1654 in the Petroslav Union, and that simply is propaganda. What that is that's from the Russian perspective, that this was their border. For the Ukrainians, they don't see that as being the defining moment of their nation building.
Vladimir Putin said post the interview that he thought he was disappointed. He was disappointed there weren't more piercing questions, etc. I mean, I'll tell you this. Some of the things that I wish Tucker Carlson would have chimed in on, things like, Mr. President, could you tell me how many abortions are in Russia these days? Has that increased or decreased under your leadership over the past 3 decades? How about mass attendance at the Divine Liturgy? Has that gone up or gone down? And where's the meter between, Russian orthodoxy, living the faith zealously, and your citizens really just looking just like the rest of us pagan heathens out west? He really did go soft on that part, don't you think?
He did, and this is the continuation of the errors of Russia that Our Lady of Fatima spoke about. One of the great errors of Russia that came out immediately after the revolution was the abolition of marriage and promotion of abortion. In 2016 or 2017, members of Putin's own party, United Russia, advocated the abolition of abortion. To their credit, Putin intervened, they have the majority in the Duma, and Putin intervened and said no. The reason he gave was the classic Bill Clinton line, let's keep abortion safe, legal, and rare. If this is the champion of our Western civilizational values, then here's a guy who has absolute control over his country. He is an absolutist, and his own party members were asking in 2017 for the outlawing of abortion, and his rationale was no, it has to be safe, legal, and rare.
I also found it interesting that Tucker Carlson didn't ask about, the head of the Wagner Group who died in a plane crash, who was, friends, and almost led a coup against the Russian government itself. You thought that would have come up in conversation, but it didn't.
Yeah, I mean, there are many questions that could have been asked, and I think a lot of questions that we conservative Catholics can ask. So, why is it that Catholic priests can be imprisoned and abducted in Russia, and there's never a peep from it? If that were to happen in Italy, that the Italian government would kidnap a Russian Orthodox priests, I mean, Russia would be sending in their tanks. What about all of these businessmen and politicians and journalists who fall out of windows in Russia? They have bad window installation programs, I guess. He doesn't mention anything about that. He doesn't mention anything about Russian Orthodox priests who speak against the war, and all of a sudden, you never hear from them again, or they lose their parish. We're dealing with a wily KGB agent, and he didn't push back. And unfortunately, the cause of conservatism 20 years down the road is going to be harmed by this. When all is seen and done, we conservatives are going to be seen as being soft on a tyrant.
Tucker Carlson has been reporting since he was at Fox News, even if I'm not mistaken, about Russian Orthodox priests being arrested in Ukraine and trying to raise the alarm of religious persecution there. You have a different take on that. Do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, that's a complete distortion. I actually went to Ukraine, and the number 2 reason I went there was to get to that. And I spoke in Kiev to Russian Orthodox, to Ukrainian Orthodox, and I can tell your audience that it is a complete distortion and it is not true. There were 52 Russian Orthodox priests in Ukraine who were caught giving information and location and supplies to the invading army. And they were arrested and they were imprisoned. I don't know what their status is now. But that's not because they were Orthodox. It was because they were committing treasonous activities. Like if you had an imam here in Baltimore or in Houston who was, feeding information to ISIS, imprisonment of them has nothing to do with Islam, has everything to do with their treasonous activity. And that's the same principle that was at stake with these men in Ukraine. What is interesting is that there is no Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Russia. Why is that? Why is it? Because we're banned. In Ukraine, Moscow-controlled Ukrainian Orthodox Church still is allowed to exist, but they are not allowed to give out location information and data and arms to the enemy.
Let's go back to sort of that's sort of the gray zone that I find in this conversation. Since Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, 2 years ago now, it's been hard to sort fact from fiction. It's really difficult to sort out the information that comes flooding through social media or the headlines and try to determine who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. We saw fake and false information in like the what was the fighter, the famous ghost fighter pilot thing that was not true, or the Ukrainians on that island that defended to the last against a Russian battleship that's not true. On the flip side of that coin, there has been many atrocities by Russian soldiers of Ukrainian citizens that goes unreported here in the West. So you mentioned in the radio side of our conversation that you've been there 3 times and you talk to people when you get there. I'm just going to ask you a very straightforward question, Father. Are you talking to only the home team? Do you only talk to Ukrainians who, of course, hate Vladimir Putin and Russian aggression? Or have you talked to anybody on the other side of the aisle?
Name any Jews in Germany who would be enthusiastic supporters of Hitler. But if you mean by that Russian speakers, then yes, I've spoken to many Russian speakers and many Ukrainian speakers. I've spoken to Russian speakers from Eastern Ukraine, from Southern Ukraine, and they're unanimous in their opposition to Putin.
When we say Russian speakers, this is something Vladimir Putin talked about in the interview. He tried to hammer the idea that these people are Russian. Like Americans living in Texas, these are Russians living in Ukraine. But is there really a cultural difference? Is there really are these really a separate peoples, or are they just part of the big family? Help me understand the clear division there.
I like to use an analogy is that, it's a Slavic family of languages, Belarusian, Ukrainian, Russian. The Russians have been trying for over 400 years to Russify their neighbors through soft and very hard forms of power. And so those that are now Russian speaking, many of whom were transplanted there during the Stalinist era, many of them do identify with Russia. They are those who really live in like Donetsk, Luhansk. Many of them just have the greatest desire to live in Russia, and they're free to go there. The rest of the Russian speakers in Ukraine, they're no more Russian than, the German speakers in Austria are German. The French speakers in, Belgium are subjects of Emmanuel Macron. They share a language, but their view of religious freedom, their view of information, of school, of politics, are radically different than people just a few miles across the border in Russia. And that's because despite its, growing pains, Ukraine has been very successful at nurturing free, independent institutions in Ukraine. I lived there in the late 90s and early 2000s for 3 years. There are no free institutions in Russia with regard to information. Now, prior to the war, there were competing news channels in Ukraine, which like here, you have your different slants on an event. They had that pre-martial law in Ukraine. Now in Ukraine, it's a different subject with the war out, and they have unified information flow.
That whole monologue of history that he was, trying to give Tucker Carlson, do you think that was just a translator, or do you think they were feeding him that information? How astute is Putin on the history?
Yeah, he's no Joe Biden. He doesn't, remember during the debate with, President Trump, when he moves and you could see that there was a wire going down under his blazer, that's not Putin. He really believes this. This is the great harm in a lie, is that you become a victim of your own lies. We read in Proverbs. The Russian Empire, the Stalinist Empire after it, the Empire now, it created a lie, and her children believe it. And so he very much believes the Russocentric view of history, and he knows it. So he's speaking with conviction, although he's not entirely correct on it. Whereas, here in the West, you would be hard-pressed to find any politician who could go back and succinctly give a recap of 1,200 years of history in 30 minutes.
Do you think Vladimir Putin has plans to push further into Europe, or is he simply trying to make,
make Russia great again and take back all of the old territories? Or do you think there's a limit, or do you think he is limitless in his ambition?
In scripture and Revelation, there's the army from the east, but in private prophecy, there's the army from the north, which I think refers to the what Ezekiel speaks about with Gog and Magog. And I think that refers to Russia. And I do believe that we're in those times. But if we are biblical people, we have to understand that those outside armies that punish Israel are pagan nations. So you have, the pagan Assyrians, the pagan Babylonians, the pagan Persians, the Egyptians. They are all at variance with God's law, but they are used by our omnipotent God to correct a wayward children. This is no compliment to Russia. This means that, his wayward children, Europe, Christian Europe, which is the product of the church, Europe is the offspring of the church, not the other way around. They are the wayward Israel, and God is going to use a pagan nation to the north, Russia, to correct it, because Russia has never repudiated its errors. There was never a Nuremberg trial like there was for Germany. So of the millions and millions and millions of Christians who were murdered, butchered, the women who were raped, the children who were forcibly taken from their Christian parents and brainwashed and re-educated and brought up in godlessness. Russia has never, ever, ever had to make amends for that. They've never come before the world community of families and specifically the Catholic Church in dust and ashes and say, we repudiate this, we are sorry. They've never done that. And in order for there to be salvation, there first needs to be repentance. Russia as a nation has never had that moment of repentance like Germany did. And for that reason, our fellow conservatives are buying snake oil when they think that the answer to our present woes are coming from someone who says that they're coming in the name of the Lord. Our Lord prophesied against this. He said, many will come in my name. And that's what's happening here.
We can expect bad things to happen. I guess the real question is, do you think Vladimir Putin has the ambition, the wherewithal, even the resource and means to invade Europe? Does he have the desire to do it? And does he have the means to do it? What would be your perspective on that?
I don't think he has reason. I think he's consumed by passion, and that creates a different kind of poker player. He doesn't have the means to do it in that his infantry are not well trained. They've lost about 40 to 50% of their trained infantry pre-2022. They've lost thousands of tanks. So in terms of conventional categories, he doesn't have the means to do it. But in terms of nuclear threat, he does have the means to do it. And that is all he has to leverage, is the threat of nuclear war. And he can get a lot of mileage out of just the threat of it. To answer your previous question, what's really behind this is something spoken about by Mark Stein in 2006. He said, it's not a question of if Russia invades Europe and its neighbors, it's a question of when. Because of abortion, the high level of death in Russia from alcoholism, HIV, highest outside of Africa, by the way, immigration, suicide. Is they are facing the demographic winter that we in the West are prognosticating for ourselves. They're facing that now. So it's a question of math. That's all it is. And he needs warm bodies or he will cease to have a country. So that's what this is about. This is about recouping population thanks to a culture of abortion and contraception.
At the end of the day, what I see in suburban Catholicism, and they're going to be spoon-fed. And they'll accept that. They'll either be liberals or they'll be conservatives, but they won't just be Catholic, let the chips fall where they may. Is that true also in Ukrainian Catholicism? Is that true? I mean, how does that play in some of these Eastern branches of the church?
We can't impose our, left-right political paradigm here in North America on the situation faced by Eastern Christians. Most Eastern Christians live in the Middle East or in the former Soviet space, a different animal. In Ukraine, I think I don't want to generalize, but my experience of Ukrainian Catholics is, they are, more traditional than, your average Christian here in North America. It's abhorrent that you would have, people receiving the Eucharist on the hand. It's abhorrent that you wouldn't go to church on the Feast of St. Peter and Paul. It's abhorrent that you would call, a boy a girl. So those things aren't even on their radar. These things are simply abhorrent to most of them. Now, in the past 3 years, they've become very aware of them because of the Soroses of the world who are using media and finance to push these issues and to make Ukraine into its acolyte. But in terms of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, they're very traditional. We're the only church that's issued an encyclical against transgenderism. We did it back in, I think, 2014. We are the only church that issued a letter against fiducia supplicans, which our patriarch did a few days after, I think it was by, the 27th of December of this past year. So, we're very traditional. But at the same time, we're living on the ground there, and we realize the truth of the matter with regard to Russia that people here just, don't know. Yeah, so to answer your question, they're more traditional.
Father, do you believe that the consecration of Russia was fulfilled according to the request by the Blessed Mother at Fatima?
It said, explicitly Russia, and in there, the wording was Russia and Ukraine, which I think was a political statement because they didn't want to portray Russia as a sole belligerent. And so there's some equivocation there, I think.
Why do you think the bishops, the Pope in particular, and the various popes who have attempted the consecration to Russia, going back to Pius XII, why do you think that they are so hesitant to just say the words as the Blessed Mother asked? Why is there always some caveat, some qualifier, some extra thing? Why can't they just say it? What are they so afraid of?
Our Lord time and again says to his disciples whom he is to send out into the world to be not afraid. And that's one of the telltale signs of sin and evil is that of fear. And I think at the root of it is we're dealing with the embodiment of evil in the 20th century. There is the concomitant effect of fear. And so I think what's behind it is just that spiritual principle of men that in the face of evil, there are only two responses. It's faith or fear. And unfortunately, I think that's been the motivation behind many of these decisions is just fear. We don't want to call the devil out.
Yeah, what do you think of the alliance, some would say unholy alliance between Iran, China, and Russia? I mean, that's telling in and of itself.
Yeah, this mystifies me. Mr. Putin is allied with China, North Korea, Iran. Yet these are the countries that are three top persecutors of Christians in the world. Yet here we have our conservative brothers and sisters in Christ in the United States supportive of Mr. Putin. So it is, sorry, I have a little invader here.
Yeah, no worries.
But this shows his true ambition. His true ambition isn't, the spreading of Christian civilization. It is a cynical use of that to a political end. So he uses the language of the gospel, the language of orthodoxy to a political end. And this is something that, Hitler did. It's something that Stalin did. And they had, nefarious alliances as well. The Soviet Union with their communist satellites around the world. And we see that with Hitler as well, that he, tried to create a Lutheran church that was aligned with the Nazi Party. He tried to utilize the Catholic Church, and many of the bishops went along with it, to advance, Arianism. And Stalin used the living church in the Soviet Union as a vessel for his ideology. And he did the same thing after 1942 until he died, giving a lot of liberty to the Russian Orthodox Church as a vehicle for Soviet propaganda. And so the same tactic is being used by Mr. Putin in dressing up his ideology with Christian veneer. And we desperate traditional Christians in the West, we're desperate for someone to rescue us from this moral mores that has surrounded us in the West. And the first leader who gives us a little bit of red meat on these issues, we're running to. And don't go there. He's a false prophet. Stalin tried that. Hitler tried it. It's not the message of Jesus Christ.
When Tucker Carlson did sort of soft pedal the whole religious aspect, I was very surprised. Number one, wasn't more specific. But number two, Putin, he basically punted on that. I couldn't believe it. Like, I thought for sure, from a politic gain standpoint, Like he should have thought, oh man, I'm going to win real brownie points with all those American evangelical conservatives when I come out sounding like the more Christian conservative politician than their own government does. But he didn't. He punted on that. I was very surprised by that. Were you?
No, I wasn't actually, because he gets architecture like the drape salesman gets architecture. You know, the drape salesman, he knows drapes, and he knows how to make drapes look good and make a room look good, but he doesn't understand the principles of architecture. Vladimir Putin does not understand the gospel of Jesus Christ. He understands empire making, and if you begin to scratch a little bit beneath the surface of it, you know, his nakedness is exposed. Here's the thing people need to remember is that he's been leading this nation for a generation. It has lower rates of church attendance than Germany and Belgium and France. Okay?
Wow.
Germany has higher church attendance rate, and Germany's abysmal. Germany has higher church attendance rates than Russia does. I've spoken to 3 priests in Russia, and independently of one another, they all give me the exact same data. Church attendance is about 1.5% of the population. That is the Sunday attendance rate. People don't understand that. People think that claim that Russia has a religious revival is true. If you scratch beneath the surface, that simply is not the case. If Vladimir Putin is a religious man, then you would think that after the generation he's been leading the country, there would be some fruit to that. You look at, King Louis of France, the influence that one man had on a whole nation. You look at Winston Churchill, not that he was a saint, but, that he had on the nation. In terms of his time in office, Putin has far exceeded both of those people, yet the effect of it is that it's an incredibly secular society in which alcoholism and church attendance rates are not what you would expect from a Christian society.
What do you make of the Alexei Navalny situation out of Russia? I think this is more proof of the Putin regime not being as conservative or Christian or friendly as a lot of us here in the West want to make him out to be.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. This is a consistent pattern. One which Tucker Carlson should have asked is that those who oppose him disappear. You can begin with Anna Politkovskaya. You can begin with, Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine, who was poisoned by dioxin poisoning. This is a consistent pattern, and so we shouldn't be surprised. Boris Nemtsov. I mean, now it's Alexei Navalny. So this is a pattern. It cannot be shooed away. Someone who claims to be in the journalist category, like Tucker Carlson, although he would say he's more of a commentator, someone who is in that journalist vocation should have had the audacity to really push Vladimir Putin on the abuse that's dished out to people like Nemtsov, Anna Politkovskaya. The list is immense, but he didn't do it. And unfortunately, that I think is going to come back and haunt Mr. Carlson for years to come.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.